Over the past few months, I've taken a look at a lot of wrestling games. Some good, some bad, some straight up ugly battlegrounds. But there's one variety I haven't fully explored yet, and that's the weird wrestling games. Now there's a lot of weird wrestling games for me to talk about. For example, The Simpsons Wrestling. I could talk about that game, but in order for me to do that, I'd have to be dead first. Well, if I'm gonna talk about weird wrestling games, there's only one game to start with, and that game is none other than WWE Crush Hour. WWE Crush Hour is the wrestling game that's less about actual wrestling and more so about cars and destruction. Now, when I think of what would make for a fun wrestling game, vehicular combat isn't the first thing that comes to mind, but apparently THQ thought otherwise when they decided to come up with this mess of a game. WWE Crush Hour is by far one of the weirdest and most obscure wrestling games I've ever played, and I genuinely have no idea why it exists. The game takes everything you know about the WWE from the arenas, match types, and even the superstars themselves and converts all of it into a demolition derby vehicular combat game, which I didn't even think that was something that was possible. This game proved it wasn't. The game was developed by Pacific Coast Power and Light, a subsidiary of THQ who is best known for games like MX Superfly, WWE Crush Hour, Road Rash 64. They closed in 2008. Crush Hour was definitely one of the bigger games they worked on, and after playing it, it's easy to see why the studio didn't last too much longer after this game's release. Now, I'm sure the devs wanted this game to be better than it turned out, so I do put most of the blame on THQ, who probably rushed this game to get it to store shelves quicker, but what I don't think THQ realized is that nobody wanted to play a wrestling game that didn't feature wrestling as a core mechanic. When the first thing people were gonna see in the box art was RVD and The Rock driving cars, it's safe to assume the game wasn't gonna be flying off store shelves. I mean, look at this. What the hell is this supposed to tell you? Also, that name just makes no goddamn sense. It's a demolition derby game. Why not call it WWE Crash Hour? It's still a dumb name regardless, but at least it makes more sense than Crush Hour. Upon its release in March of 2003, the game was met with pretty mixed reviews. It definitely wasn't a terrible game by any means, and considering the fact that it released for only $20, I would say that you definitely got what you paid for with this game. Thing is, I just don't think the world was ready for a WWE vehicular combat game at the time, and it still isn't. Even with it being $20 at release, there were still better alternatives at the time, like Twisted Metal Black. There was really no reason to play this game at all. Anyways, with all that out of the way, I think it's time we take a look at WWE Crush Hour and find out what the fuck this game was all about. Alright, let's get the positives out of the way. The game looks pretty alright for 2003 standards. The arenas look cool. Now who's ready for me to bitch? Yeah, unfortunately, that's about where the positives end when it comes to this game. The rest of the game is pretty shallow and overall not very good. The biggest problem with the game is the gameplay, because somehow they managed to make driving in this game feel like shit. Trying to drive in this game feels like trying to drive over ice since you're constantly sliding all over the place. I would much rather drive around in GTA 4 for 5 hours straight than drive in this game for 10 minutes. Not to mention accelerating in this game always feels like a death sentence because you'll almost always lose control over your vehicle and drive off the arena. I will get to the arenas later, but my god, these arenas were just not built for vehicular combat. Well, now that I've established just how terrible the driving is, we might as well talk about the core gameplay and the match types because they're pretty interesting to say the least. Essentially, the gameplay of Crush Hour just boils down to drive around an arena and kill your opponents. You heard that right. Kill your opponents. This is probably the first and only time I've ever seen the word kill used as one of the main objectives in a WWE video game ever, and it really threw me for a loop the first time I saw it. Murder isn't a common thing in wrestling games, so the fact that I'm being told to kill my opponents in this game is pretty wild. Moving on to the match types themselves, there's quite a few to choose from. Most of the match types in the game share the same objective: reach a specific number of KOs and win. Some match types shake that up though, like the gauntlet match where you have to collect a certain number of stars rather than going for KOs, or the steel cage match which has you and your opponents fighting over a contract in a steel cage. Even with the little bit of variety in the objectives to the match types, it's still not enough to prevent them from getting repetitive over time. Sure, you could make the argument that this isn't one of those games you're gonna play for hours on end, but if you're playing this game with friends, the last thing you want is for everyone everyone to get bored because the matches got too repetitive. Some of the match types aren't even all that interesting, like hardcore for example, which sounds like it'd be more exciting than it is, but no, all you have to do to win is hold on to the hardcore championship for a certain amount of time without losing it. The Royal Rumble could have been cool if it was about eliminating your opponents, you know, like the actual Royal Rumble match, but instead you and your opponents have to fight over a crown. Now I say fight over, but in reality, when your AI opponent gets the crown, the game just ends, so it's less of a fight with your opponents and more of a fight to just keep the damn game going. Honestly, the best part about the match types is the arenas the matches take place on. It's so cool seeing these shows like SmackDown and Survivor Series turned into these over-exaggerated demolition derby arenas. All the arenas look fantastic as far as the visuals go, but gameplay-wise, they just do not work. Some of the arenas like Raw and SmackDown are fine since those are closed arenas, but stages like Bottom Line and Running the Gauntlet are by far the worst since you constantly have to watch how fast you're going, otherwise you're bound to fall off the edge of the levels. As for the gameplay, it definitely leans on the shallow side of things as all you really do is shoot and ram your opponents. It doesn't feel nearly as engaging as something like Twisted Metal because it hardly has any depth. There's power-ups you'll find around each arena, but other than that, the gameplay really has nothing else going for it. It just feels like the devs took the gameplay of Twisted Metal Black and stripped it of everything that made that game's gameplay as fun as it was. It's not to say you can't have fun with the gameplay of Crush Hour, it's just after a while, that gameplay loop of shooting and ramming your opponents will get old pretty quickly. Now that I've talked about the gameplay and match types, I want to go ahead and talk about the roster, and honestly, it's not all that bad. First off, we have to get the negatives out of the way. The models for the superstars in this game are god awful. Now look, I get this is a game from 2003, but even SmackDown Just Bring It had better looking models, and that game came out in 2001. I understand they may not have had the biggest budget when it came to the development of this game, but I feel like they could have at least done something to make these models look just a little better. Hulk Hogan looks pretty dumb, and RVD looks more baked than usual, which is saying something. The game features the most notable superstars from that time period, like Undertaker, Kane, the Hardy Boys, etc, etc. Honestly, the selection of superstars isn't bad, but for some odd reason, Eddie Guerrero just isn't in the game. Yeah, put 2003 pre-motorcycle Chuck Palumbo in the vehicular combat game, but not Eddie Guerrero, the guy who was famous for literally riding a lowrider to the ring during this time. Each superstar has their own unique vehicle equipped with different weapons, all having their own stats such as speed and strength. I will say that the cars themselves are pretty well designed and fit each superstar really well. Undertaker is a motorcycle with coffins on the front, Brock Lesnar is a giant fucking armored truck, and of course, William Regal has a British roadster because, well, he's British. The devs honestly did a pretty great job at taking the gimmicks of all the superstars and turning them into cars. It's just a shame the rest of the game isn't all that great. As shallow and repetitive as this game is, I will say that it is at least more fun with friends, which is honestly what matters the most for a game like this. If you're playing with AI the whole time, yeah, it's gonna be pretty fucking boring, but if you have one or more friends to play it with, it can make for a pretty fun time. Good luck trying to get your friends to play WWE Crush Hour with you though. You wanna play Crush Hour? Well, now that I've talked about all that, it leaves us with one more mode to talk about, and it might just be the worst part about the entire game. The mode I'm referring to is none other than the season mode, and it's by far the most nonsensical season mode I've ever played in a wrestling game. Now, if you were expecting this game to have a good season mode, I have no idea what else to tell you because the season mode in this game is genuinely the worst thing I've ever played. The season mode in this game sort of works like the season modes that you'd see in the actual WWE games around this time, as you pick a superstar to play through the mode with and then play through a series of matches. The season mode lasts 17 weeks, which sounds like a lot. I mean, that is 17 matches you get to play, so what's the big deal? Well, the biggest problem is that each match in the season mode is the same damn thing. I already talked about how bitch basic the modes were earlier in the video, so imagine playing those 17 times in a row. Yeah, it wouldn't make for a very fun experience. The thing is that this season mode could have been legitimately interesting considering the story they built up for this game was actually pretty cool. The story is really simple, but it's still interesting enough to where it could have made for an awesome story mode. Essentially, Mr. McMahon took over all the networks and created a demolition derby show featuring 30 WWE superstars superstars. As you play through the season mode, you'll see cutscenes with different superstars in various reality show settings. They're really charming and are, in my opinion, the best part about the whole mode. Aside from the cutscenes, the season mode just feels really repetitive and the matches don't really feel like they're leading to anything, so once you do make it to the final fight against Mr. McMahon himself, it doesn't really feel that special. If the season mode was shorter, I'd probably enjoy it more, but 17 weeks of doing the exact same thing is just not my idea of fun. The objective mode for each match always boils down to kill 10 opponents in a free-for-all, which is already incredibly tedious when you have to do it in one match alone, but having to do it for multiple in a row is just on a whole nother level of bad. All in all, Crush Hour season mode isn't anything special, and if you've never played it, you're not missing out on much. With that though, I think it's time to end the video because I don't know how much more of Crush Hour I can take. In conclusion, WWE Crush Hour isn't a very good game, but it's also not the worst thing I've ever played. If this was the only game you had back in the day and you didn't have access to any of the Twisted Metal games, this game probably would have gotten the job done. Just because it would have gotten the job done though, doesn't necessarily make it a good game. The main issue is that everything in this game, while fine for the most part, is just super repetitive, and after a few hours, the game really just starts to overstay its welcome. If the matches offered more variety in their objectives, or there were just more matches in general, it might have made the game more fun, but because this was a $20 release, it wasn't able to go too crazy in the content department. It honestly kind of sucks that this game turned out the way it did, because as weird as the concept is, taking a bunch of WWE superstars and putting them in a demolition derby, it could have worked. Now I'm sure someone out there is nostalgic for this game, and that's fine. If you like the game, you like the game. But me personally, I'm just not a very big fan of Crush Hour. I'd still much rather play this over 2K Battlegrounds though.